Michael Whalen's greatest claim to fame, by far, is having contributed to Synth and Sofware several times. He's also been awarded 2 Emmys, according to Wikipedia, scored 650 film scores and thousands, unquote, of jingles. And he's been a professor at multiple prestigious universities. That's not in question. And he's a prolific recording artist. Either is that. We talked to him just before his latest album, Imaginary Trains, was released, and also just before a concert he gave in support of EMI-app, the Electronic Music Education and Preservation Project. You read about it here in Synth and Sofware when we announced it. Right now you're listening to some of the title track to Imaginary Trains. I think you'll like it right away, but I recommend listening to it multiple times. It's, hey, wait a minute music. There are all kinds of subtle details that would be pretty much impossible to take in all at once. And the slow-moving harmony and uncomplicated melodies belie just how sophisticated the music actually is. There also seems to be some minimalism going on, or at least the influence of it, but it's unique. Michael is an outstanding musician, a sharp guy, very interesting and articulate, and it's fair to say a player who really likes synths and who just knows how to make them sing. He also has a lot to say about Dolby Atmos, Apple Spatial Audio, a subject we've been covering closely here. We think you'll enjoy the conversation. You have a new album called Imaginary Trains.
That's true.
Which is dropping in 3 days?
Yes, sir.
So you're just finishing it, I assume? I'm kidding. But...
I don't even have time for this. I got to get this finished. Oh, my God. Yes. So I've been working on it for, it feels like over a year. Because it was funny because I think I started it a couple of times and I had this idea, well, hey, I'm going to do an album that's sort of celebrating my influences with German electronic music. And then I was like, this is silly. I'll put it up on a shelf and we'll see what happens. And then it was a couple of times of, no, I really want to do this. So I had to kind of fight my own hesitation about it. And now that it's done, I'm like, well, that was dumb, but that's the process. So it was kind of a weird process for me of like my own sort of self-doubt, but I'm very proud of this record.
What I heard sounded really good. It's not a meditation record like your last one, but it has a contemplative feel. Let's put it that way.
It's a relaxing record. It's like, you're having sort of a existential ontological moment. It's funny because there's a lot of motion in the music because, I'm vibing on Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk and all this stuff. But beyond all of that, I have an enormous history of trains in my life. So even from when I was a kid, I went to boarding school in Delaware. My parents lived in Washington, D.C., and the way that I got to and from school was the train. And that was 4 years and dozens and dozens and dozens of train rides. And then going into college and then all the travel I've done and all the work that I've done in Europe, I am a train fanatic. So this idea of having motion in the music and having it be sort of calm all at the same time is something that I've been experiencing my whole life. This idea of just being like, the world's going by at 100 miles an hour and you're just sort of gazing out the window and your heart rate is going down. I love that idea. I love this idea that you could be moving quickly, but moving calmly through the world. And I think that's very much what this music's about. I mean, it's terrific for driving. My wife and I, we did a Sunday morning reading the New York Times to it. That works great. So it's a great, like, wherever you're being kind of record. And for the more sort of technical minded people, it's, from what I've heard from my friends, taking apart all the layers and listening to it deeply is also cool. This is the first record I've ever done in Atmos. So we did Atmos versions of this. So if you don't have 11 speakers in your house, you can just listen to it on Apple Music with earpods, and it works great, actually. I was a little hesitant about it, but I tried it, and I was like, this works. And the record spatially is very cool. I definitely recommend that.
That's interesting. So tell me about what you used to create the Atmos mix. You used did in Logic, I assume?
I did not do them because I am that smart. So what I did was I did stem mixes of the stereo mixes that I had already completed, and then I sent them to Tom Eaton, my mastering engineer, and he did the Atmos mixes, and trying to match as much as possible what I had done and kind of what could be done in Atmos. In his new studio in New Hampshire, he set up an Atmos room and I was the guinea pig. So it came out really well. And so yeah, so he took my stems and he did a great job. It really came out well.
Okay, unfortunately, I haven't heard it in Atmos, so I'm asking naive questions. But what were the stems that you gave him? What types of stems would you give him?
I actually gave him a lot of stems. So instead of just being like percussion, bass, piano, melody, that kind of stuff, I actually broke it out quite a bit. So I'd say for any one of the songs, there would be 16 or 20 stereo pairs. So, so it would be like melody one, melody two, melody three, like 3 or 4 different passes of the pianos and the pads, multiple passes of the percussion, because I wanted the percussion to come from multiple places. So we had to break it out for that. The songs in many cases have 3, 4, 5 different bass sounds. So I broke out the basses into left, right, stereo. Sorry, they were mono signals, but I broke them out as left, right, so he could like have some control over them. And then there's all these like effects and risers and transitions and things like that. So there's probably a couple of passes of the transitions. At one point, at one point, Tom and I had the conversation of maybe I should just give you the session and he's like, no. I want your thing on this. I want your treatment on this. I want your effects on this. I want your EQ on this. I'm like, okay. So that's what we ended up doing.
So you made the stereo mix yourself?
Yeah.
How would you compare the surround mix or the Atmos mix to the stereo mix?
Okay, so if you're listening to speakers and it feels like it's coming at you this way and it's left, right, the Atmos is you're in the center of the room and everything is around you and you get to kind of move around and you get to kind of audition the melody over here and the synth pad over here and then the string thing over here, but you're in the center. And so it would be sort of akin to those great photographs of like when Frank Sinatra was recording and he was in the middle of the orchestra and he never used headphones and he loved that sense of like the band being around him. It would be akin to that. It's like the band's around you and they're doing whatever they're doing, but you're the focus of it. And it's terrific. I mean, I'm not quite a fan of Atmos yet because there's things that work and there's things that don't. I think there's a lot of people who are mixing in Atmos who probably shouldn't be. But on high-end records like Adele did her album and they did an Atmos version of it's beautiful, highly recommended. And a lot of those tracks are like piano and vocal and just the way they did the space and it's just gorgeous. So if you can listen to some high-endy records where they've done Atmos, it's definitely worth it. I mean, I spent several weeks mixing the stereo version, but we spent 5 weeks mixing the Atmos version. There's so many variables. There's so many things to get into it. And I wasn't going crazy, like, beating Tom. I think a lot of it was, we really just wanted to make sure that first, technically, it was going to work on all the sort of different manifestations of this. And like, now that we have the technical part together, how far do we want to go with this? Is this going to be like a roller coaster ride of things kind of spinning around you? Or is this going to be something that's going to feel like a little bit more musical? And I think what we ended up with was more on the musical side, but occasionally there's like a surprise that comes and like some sound will come like whizzing by you that you weren't expecting. And so there's like little details of things that are just like kind of tasty. That makes me happy because it's not a video game. It's not designed for that. It's really designed to be something that's supposed to be in the environment with you. So I don't want it to be distracting, but I do love the idea that it can kind of hug you and be immersive.
So I assume you did the stereo mix first.
Yeah.
Okay. So did he use that as a reference? What I'm trying to figure out is, apart from the actual space, musically, how is the impact different?
So the stereo mix was done and the mastering was done. And so he had already kind of experienced the record. He was already really deep inside of it. So we kind of turned the page and said, okay, now we're going to do the Atmos, but we're going to use this finished stereo master as sort of the Bible. But that was going to be for how we kind of wanted to deal with the bass, even in the sub. The weird thing, the weird thing that happens in my music, I mean, there are tracks on this album that 130 tracks, 140
Wow.
tracks.
Wow.
So I do a lot of stuff where I'll have sounds on top of each other and I'll play different inversions of chords on top of each other so the sounds don't get canceled out. But what happens in Atmos is that stuff gets pulled apart. So now you start hearing the inversions of chords and like sounds that I don't want to say are abandoned, but they're definitely not sitting inside the same sort of sonic frame as they would be in a stereo thing. So I think that's one of the things that we spent a lot of time with was now that we have this 360-degree frame, how do we want to be framing this? And ultimately what I said to Tom and what he ultimately did was to trust the music and say, you know, and by the way, I'm going to say this and I'm not comparing myself, but if you take like a Tchaikovsky score, like the Nutcracker, and you fold it all the way down, take the string parts out and you get it down to like some of the brass parts and a few of the woodwind parts or whatever, it still works. And so are we trusting the music to kind of work in this new situation, or must we be constantly kind of like putting in the sonic cotton candy to kind of like make it all work? And ultimately what we did was we let some of the stuff kind of just hang out there on its own, and it's cool. It's a different experience. It's a different musical experience. It's definitely a different sound design experience, because now I can hear sounds on the Atmos version much more clearly than I can on some of the stereo versions. And it's just a different experience. I don't know if it's better, it's different, especially on some of the sparser songs. Like Wayward Son is a, you know, very sort of sparse, and like those pads just sort of float like out there in like La La Land on the Atmos version. So trust your sounds.
How much of what you hear on multiple speakers translates to the Apple headphones, AirPods?
My friend, that is the $64,000 question. So listening on speakers versus listening on the earpods are two completely different things. Like, you want to go to a room where it is properly set up and you want to listen to speakers. The earpod thing is a binaural sort of workaround that Dolby has been working on for the last 5 years or so. And it's a little smoke and mirrors, and it's not quite the thing, but it gives you enough of it where, you know, if you don't want to spend thousands of dollars in your living room to do that, I understand. I wasn't a Tesla, was another one of the big high-end electric cars, and they have Atmos systems as standard stereos. I was with a friend and he was like, hey, I downloaded your album, and I was listening to the album in Atmos in his car. It was outrageous. It was so cool. So I highly, highly, highly recommend, if you listen to anything in Atmos, whether it's a movie or music or whatever, speakers are 1,000 times better than the earpods. But if you want to have the experience and you just want to get a sort of a sense of what's going on, the earpods are a good sort of intermediate step.
You have a concert coming up. Can you tell me about that?
So MEAP, a lot of people have no idea what MEAP is. It is the Electronic Music Education and Preservation Project. It is the largest private collection of synthesizers, electronics, and stage gear in the world. It's sort of a private museum, but it's more like a warehouse where things are set up nicely. And I've been associated with them for a couple of years, and I wanted to create an event for this album, and I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to somehow feature the music and play. And I said, hey guys, let's do a concert. And I will put together my dream rig out of these, I mean, honestly, Nick, I mean, not even exaggerating. I think they have maybe 3,000 synthesizers. It's like a number like that. The scary part about EMI-App is most of their gear has a really, really serious provenance. So, for example, they have Keith Emerson's entire stage rig from Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Wow.
The entire thing. They have the original custom Moog modular. So the most dangerous synthesizer in the world, it lives in Philadelphia, and EMI-App. And his C3 and that organ that he beat the crap out of, with the niece and all of that stuff. They have all of it. They have his Steinway grand piano that he wrote his piano concerto on, and he did that incredible picture in Works and all that stuff. They have the 4 original prototype mini Mokes, the Model A, the Model B, the Model C, and the Model D. And you think to yourself, well, this should probably be in the musical instrument collection at the Met in New York. It's not, it's at EMI-App in Philadelphia. They have 7 modulars, Mokes. They have the Moog from Columbia University. They have the old Princeton one. They have one of the ones that was some major Hollywood sound designer. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, this place. And at first, you walk around and you think you have a sense of what's happening. And then you go to the warehouse. And then you see that they have 18-wheel trailers filled with stuff that hasn't even been unloaded yet.
Wow.
And it's breathtaking. And the condition of the equipment it's not even mint. It's like museum quality. So like the instruments that I was playing, like the 13 instruments, in my rig, I mean, so I have Keith's modular Moog. I used his Hammond C3. I'm using Bernie Worrell's Mini Moog Model D. I'm using an RA Mini Moog that's serial number 16, which means it was the 16th one ever built. So I'm imagining Bob Moog, just soldering this himself. When you get into it, it's almost overwhelming. Like if you think of the synthesizer, or if you've seen a picture of a prototype from Keyboard Magazine in the 80s and 90s, it's probably in that building. They have the original Prophet 10 that doesn't have double manual keyboard, and it has the heat sink because it got really, really hot. And you'd say, wow, I can't believe that Dave Smith doesn't have this. And not only do they have that, but they also have the other prototype. They have the original prototypes of the Memory Moog. There's 2 of them. They have the original prototype of the Poly Moog. There's 2 of them. They're the original prototypes of the Moog Liberation. I think they have 2 or 3 of them. I mean, when you kind of just dive into the water and you start looking around at what there is, you kind of can't believe it. And they're incredibly nice. Drew, who runs it, is incredibly nice. And they really like this idea. And so the idea is that it's a benefit concert. The $10 ticket, 100% of it's going to go to EMI-App, which is a 501c3 charity. And they're doing a lot of educational outreach. They take things to schools, school kids come in, they tour the stuff, they talk about it, and they talk about why is one instrument more important than the other. And it's not just, that someone famous played it, it's that the capability of this instrument, like what the instrument helped the artist sort of unlock in their own music and what it created for them. And so EMI-App is a really cool place. And now that thankfully, COVID is beginning to lift a little bit and people are beginning to kind of visit things a little bit more, I think, the door is going to open a little bit more on EMI-App. But what we decided to do was to do it as a streaming concert because we knew there would be people from all over the world who'd want to see this. So the guy who owns it, Vince Popillo, he's in the food business. And in college, he played keyboards. And like a lot of guys, he, met a girl and he had to stop playing music and he sold all of his gear. And then he became very, very, very successful with this company. And he decided to say, hey, I should buy one of those. And then I should buy one of those. He started this in the 90s when these vintage keyboards that are going for tens of thousands of dollars, I mean, you couldn't give them away. I mean, the CS80, the Yamaha CS80 he has there is the nicest CS80 I've ever played in my life. And he's like, I bought it for a few $1,000s in the 90s. He's a very, very smart guy. He loves the gear. He loves the legacy. He really wants to keep the conversation about this gear alive, because I think there's sort of two things that are happening. Number one is a lot of this gear is becoming so old that it's nearly impossible to fix. So they have these young technicians come up from Philadelphia, and once a week they are in-house at MEAP, and they fix the gear and they maintain it, and they do a beautiful job. They really, really, really do a great job. But I think the other part of it is we live in the world of plugins, and I can't tell you, Nick, how many people have said to me in the last month, well, I don't understand. Why do you got all this hardware? Why don't you just do this with plugins? I'm like, because it's a concert. It's a performance. It's drama. It's theater. The other thing that I think is also really important is when you put your hand on a keyboard and it gives you that sort of that feedback of like how it feels and how the key dip is different than the other keyboard you just touched and whatever, it changes your performance. It changes like how you approach the music. And being in the space where you have all of this gear around you, it's thrilling. It's wonderful. And yes, can I sit down with plugins and can I program all these sounds? Sure. Is it really boring? Absolutely. And it's funny. I mean, like I've talked to people like my friend Steve Porcaro, who he toured all over the world with Toto. He's done all these sessions, whatever. He's like, the last thing I want to do is drag equipment from one place to another. So when I play live, I got it, all sitting in a computer, and then I close it up and I go home and I sleep, and I'm a happy guy. And he's like, the last thing I want to do is think about hardware or fixing hardware or maintaining hardware. I understand that. I mean, I love hardware. I love the inspiration, but I would say, frankly, Imaginary Trains is probably half hardware and half plugins. There are plugins that I love to use. I love the Cherry Audio stuff. I think Dan and his group there have done such an amazing job. I think the Quadra has single-handedly completely changed my opinion of the ARP Quadra, and I'm not playing an ARP Quadra because he fixed all the weird wonkiness of it. But just being around a beautiful Quadra, like they have one at MEAP, it's so gorgeous. But do I want to think about, are the circuit boards plugged in, and is it going to work, and what's going to happen to the output? Not when I'm working on a record. So I think what this concert is a fusion of the work that I did on this album. I stripped out about 50% of the parts so I could play them live on all the gear. It became like not replicating the record on vintage gear. It was, what do these instruments say to me, and how are they going to inspire me to kind of elevate this music to a different place? So even if you listen to the album on Friday, I'm not going to play note for note what I did on the album. But they have a GX1. It's one of two, maybe three working GX1s on the planet. People might remember that the GX1 was a favorite of Keith Emerson. John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin had one. Stevie Wonder called it the Dream Machine. It's an incredible synthesizer, but it's closer. I know a lightning bolt's going to come kill me, so it's been nice talking to you. It's closer to an organ in a lot of ways, but the sound is so incredible, and the aftertouch, and you have this ability to take the keyboard and you can do modulation and you could do pitch change by moving your hand from side to side. And it has all of this stuff that in some ways made it into the CS80, and then in some ways the technology just sort of like fell off the table because it would have been too expensive to implement. But it's an incredible performance instrument, and it's like an incredible privilege to be able to play one. Do I want a GX1 in my studio? I do not. For example, like you can't take a GX1 and take a 1/4-inch cable and plug it into your interface. You can't do that. It's got speakers, you got to mic the speakers, and then you got to take that, and then it goes into the thing and whatever. And so it's really set up as an organ with incredible analog circuitry that can do a lot of things, but it's not built around the practicalities of being in the studio in the 21st century. Absolutely not.
What is your opinion, or have you ever used things like the Rolly keyboard? You mentioned the sideways modulation.
Yeah, I had a Rolly for a while, and it was funny because the way they set it up is their sounds are very conducive to their keyboard, and if you want to go use other people's sounds, they're not. So I found it very frustrating because I didn't want to use their sounds on things, because in some ways they were kind of just they were fine. But what I ended up doing with the Rolly was I used it as an alternate controller. So I would use it like a ribbon controller, or I would do sound design things with it, and I would do really kind of cool, fun sort of aftertouch and trigger certain effects with it. I saw a thing the other week that the company is reconstituted. They're coming out with a new keyboard and all that stuff. What I'd love to see is the company somehow meet us players in the middle. Instead of us having to sort of conform to their thing, it would be really nice if they could find a way to make that world work a little closer to who we are as players. And
so that would just, presumably that would just take some kind of translation software to translate the MIDI messages into something the instruments you're playing with it understands.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine it would be a big adjustment. So I'm surprised that nobody has either made this mod as a third party thing, or the company hasn't come in and said, hey guys, we've heard your cries, here we go. But I think if they did that, I think it would become a much more usable thing, because like if I make a sound on, I don't know, like the Moke 1 or something, and I want to use the Rolly as the controller on it, and I know that all or is many more of the control messages from the Rolly are actually going to be read by the Moke. Now we're talking. Now we're having a different conversation. That would be cool.
It seems like it'd be pretty easy to program into Logic too, into the environment.
It would be, and I gotta say, I mean, when I switched to Logic 7 years ago, people were kind of like, I can't believe you're using Logic. That's stupid, whatever. And it's interesting in the last couple of years how many people have come over, because I think Logic has done a great job at embracing technology and integrating things quickly. Have they integrated the Atmos thing a little too quickly? We'll have to see about that. But on things like, control messages and things like, I do all kinds of fun stuff with the gear and sending messages out, and it gets read by Logic easily. And I don't have any problems like sending MIDI stuff into it at all. So it's great.
I count 6 keyboards around you. Are those the ones that you gravitate towards the most, or is that just that's just what you happen to have set up now?
So I got the Mini Moke, I got the Waldorf vocoder, which you probably can't see. I got the Prophet 5 reissue, the VL1, Yamaha GS2 FM synthesizer, the Sequential Pro 3, the Moke 1, which is only an 8 voice, which people always argue with me about, but I'm like, yeah, you're fine. The Yamaha DX1. I have a brand new Waldorf Iridium, which I absolutely adore. Polyphonic aftertouch, thank you guys. And then my friends at Yamaha got me a CP88 Logic piano, which has been terrific. And some Harmonican Mother 32 and the DFAM, the Moog little semi-modulars, which I really like. So,
how often do you change that setup?
Constantly.
Oh, okay.
It's funny because people look at a photo from 6 months ago, and then they see like one from like last week on Instagram. They're just like, so what happened? Where's the gear? Like somebody wrote to me saying, where's your ARP 2600 reissue? I'm like, well, it was on 4 albums. Or we're making way for other things, because I think one of the things that happens when you do so much music, between the album stuff and the soundtrack stuff, like right now I'm working on 3 movies as a music supervisor. I'm scoring a movie, and I just finished Imaginary Trains, and I have 4 other albums that are in various stages of being done. This stuff gets used. So when people are like, well, I guess you just got bored with it, I'm like, yeah, it's not that simple. And at a certain point, you kind of, this is going to sound obnoxious, and I really don't want it to sound obnoxious, but if you're using the gear and you're really doing sound design on it, you get to the back of things pretty quickly. So for about 2.5, 3 years, I had a Schmidt 8 voice. And people are like, I can't believe you got rid of your Schmidt. I'm like, kind of. It's nice, but it has a very, 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 very specific quality of sound. And I took that thing and I turned it upside down, inside out. I made it do cartwheels. I even ran through a Marshall amp. I was doing everything I could think of, and I'm like, I could sell it for almost what I paid for it, and I could buy more stuff. So that's what I did.
I asked you about this last time. You had a great lead synth sound that you got straight out of the Synth in Logic.
I did. So on my album Future Shock, I had a distorted lead sound, and my friend Jordan Rudess, who everybody knows from Dream Theater, I was on the phone with him, and I was like, hey, can we talk distorted lead sounds? And he's like, sure. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do what you and Derek Sheridan do and Jan Hammer and a few other million people, whatever, but I'm playing with this idea, and what do you think? And so what it was in Logic, I used a very plain vanilla Mini Moog sound. So I'm using an Arturia Mini Moog plugin. See, I can use plugins. And using my Montage 8, my master controller as the controller. And I built an amp model in Logic that I love. So it's basically like a Mesa Boogie type model with that kind of California mid-range crunch. And then two things Jordan suggested. He's like, one, someplace you've got to have like some mod thing that's not just vibrato. You've got to have some way of changing the texture of it. And he's like, it doesn't have to be like feedback, but it's like the sound can't just be like the bendy kind of predictable thing. It's got to have, the way he kind of described it was sort of like a rise and a fall to it, because like the sound that he uses with Dream Theater, it has so much dimension on it, and he's doing his thing with the ribbon controller, and it has so many sort of different little partials to it. So that was one thing. And then the other thing is he's like, you really, really need to figure out how to make it dynamic. He's like, it's one thing to like take a synthesizer, run it through an amplifier, crush it with compression, and then it's up in your face. But how are you going to make it musical? It has a little bit of compression on it, but the volume thing on it really made the sound speak, and it really gave it kind of an interesting sort of quality of sound. So it's not just like loud all the time. The mediums and the dynamic build between the medium sound and the loud sound, that was the most interesting part of the whole thing. What's also interesting about it is the sound on the Mini Moog actually has quite a bit of attack on it. So if you sit on it, it actually has like a nice sort of build built into it, on top of the mod, on top of the vibrato, on top of like, going crazy with the pitch wheel. And so between all of that stuff, I came up with a sound that was, to me, was a lot of fun. The cherry on top was the slap echo that I did, which I love. Like when you listen to like The Edge from U2, or even like Jimmy Page, the stuff he was doing with Led Zeppelin in the late 70s, like later Led Zeppelin, you can hear he's got what guitarists call that sort of greasy sound. It's got that delay thing, and it's got that flange thing on it. I love that quality of sound. Steve Lukather from Toto does the same thing, where it's not like it's just over processed. It's like the processing is baked into it, and the delay becomes part of the experience of the lead. And I love that sound. So I worked on it real hard. It came out really well. A lot of people asked me about that lead sound, and it may make a comeback. So
you heard it here first.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't put that much thought into every sound, I assume, right? That much
Oh, I
work?
do.
You
Oh, I
do?
do.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, because we may have talked about this, on some of the other stuff, but I make a pile of sounds before I start writing music. And Imaginary Trains was absolutely part of it. But what I did on this that I didn't do on many of my other records was I made a lot of sequence patterns, arpeggiation patterns. And so there are songs on this record that have textures and patterns that are made up of 20 different parts. And so I was playing with things and I really wanted to try to get each of the parts kind of talking to each other and to get that sort of holistic thing happening. Back in 2006, I worked on a score called Slavery in the Making of America for PBS. It was a really terrific project I got to work on. And one of the musicians I worked with was a man named Kimati Denizulu, who really was the world expert on slave music and African music and how it kind of came to America. He did a lot of work with John Williams on Amistad, and he like Kimati was the guy. In his other life, he was the percussionist for Sonny Rollins, monster player, but he had this incredible encyclopedic knowledge of slave music. So he was the guy who taught me about how African rhythms worked and about the master drum patterns and how all the other patterns around it all kind of fed the master pattern. But if you pull them apart, you go, wait a second, this is completely, are these in the same tempo? And so it's a life that is completely free of quantization. We're not thinking about chopping up 16th notes. We're not thinking about grids. We're not thinking about any of that crap. This is rhythms that really breathe and they move and they do whatever they do. And this is about creating patterns that move across the bar line. And so what I really wanted to do with Imaginary Trains was to create movement. I'd love to call it arpeggiation, but it's not really movement, like these sort of kinetic parts that weren't necessarily so strictly tied to a downbeat. And so I think in many cases I was successful because you can point at it and the music, flows and it feels nice and whatever, but it's still tight. And so I think I figured out a nice balance. But to answer your original question, yeah, it took me a long time to figure this out. It took me a few months to kind of get parts kind of working the way I wanted them to. And it was really interesting what happened about it, because what I was doing was taking arpeggiators and just throwing the tempo thing out the window. And I just wanted the color to kind of happen in certain spots. And it wasn't like random. It was, I want it to happen here, and then I wanted to have it here, and then I want it to happen here. So the colors all have their little moment in the sun. And then once you kind of see the whole thing sort of coalesce, you're like, okay, now I'm going to write a song to this. Okay, now we have something that's working and moving and breathing and doing what but will I ever do that again? I don't know. It was a lot. All kidding aside, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work to do that.
So when you approach a film score, do you sort of work the same way, setting up a palette, I guess, of sounds and of patterns and so on?
Most film composers will create a template for a movie. Like some of them have templates already set up if they're working on a TV show and they have things they know work. If they're working on a movie and they have a basic idea of like how they're going to produce it or what kind of orchestra they're going to have, okay, they have those sort of their orchestral thing or whatever. What I do when I do soundtrack is a fusion between what I do with the preparation that I do on my recording stuff, and I have a really solid scoring template of things that I love. And then I have a lot of room to kind of bring in other things. One of the things that I think has been really cool in my career is I'll come up with something cool on a score, and then I'll use it 6 months or a year later on an album, or I'll do an album thing, and then I'll use that on a score. And having that go back and forth has been terrific. To have your scoring work be kind of your R&D department for the stuff you're going to do on albums, that's really nice.
So when you're doing your concert, in your concert on Friday, how does that translate to different instruments?
Okay.
What was the process is what I'm asking about. Because these are instruments you don't use every day, so.
It's true. I mean, one of the things that's been really, really interesting is, I've posted on Instagram and on Facebook, the rig, and everyone's like, "You've got 3 mini Mogs. Why would you have 3 mini Mogs?" And I'm like, well, Rick Wakeman had 5. The way I'm approaching the rig is it's a big circle of stuff around me, and it's all choreographed per song. So I know, for example, like the first song is going to be CP88, Electric Grand, DX1. I have a beautiful pad sound, which I spent a lot of time putting together. Mini Moog, and then there's a section with the CS80 and the Rhodes, and I'm going to do a little bit on the Prophet, and then I'm going to come back. If I was a subway, I'd have 2 stops. I'd have the first stop, and then I go make another stop, and then I come back. And it was funny because I remember when I was a kid, I saw Asia on their first big tour, and Jeff Downs had that incredible setup in the back. I think he had 20 keyboards, and it was so big from side to side that he had like 2 organs because he couldn't run from one side to another to play the organ part, so he had 2. And I remember he was talking on, I think, either Japanese television or British TV, and he was talking about, how do you play so many keyboards at once? And he's like, I don't. The way I do it is I have a song, I know what I need to do, I'm going to use this part of the setup, and then I'm going to move to another part of the setup, and I'm going to move to another part of the setup. So that has very much been my roadmap for Friday, which is I know what I'm going to do for individual songs, and then I'm going to sort of concentrate on 1 or 2 or 3, maybe 4 instruments, and that's it. Am I going to play 13 synthesizers at the same time? No, I don't want to disappoint anybody immediately. When people are like, well, so you're going to play GX1 on every song? It's like, no, I'm not. I mean, not even, Keith Emerson's modular Moog. It's an incredible instrument, but the thing sounds like it's screaming all the time. Screaming. And if you know anything about my music, it's not screaming music. So I actually have a song near the end where it's going to be kind of like a jam song. If you've ever seen my Instagram, I do like these 60-second like little shred videos where like I play fast, people go, wow. So imagine I did like a 3.5-minute version of that, and that's going to be the GX1, the modular Moog, Jamathon, and people are going to be like, wow. But on most of my music, I can't use those instruments because I'm not going to be trying to emulate what I did on the album, but I do want to keep things sort of emotionally kind of in the same universe. So there's a Selena string synthesizer, which I'd never used before, and it has the string section, which everyone knows, but it also has a synthesizer built into it, which I never knew that they did that. And so it's sort of like an ARP Omni on heroin. I don't even know how to describe this thing because the synthesizer is so crazy that you can do so much. It's like an ARP Odyssey built into an ARP Omni. It's a really great synthesizer. I've had a lot of fun playing with sounds and getting things together for it. But that thing has changed the way I'm approaching 2 or 3 of the songs for the concert. I don't want to say I'm rewriting my own material, but I'm definitely approaching things very differently because of that keyboard. So it's fun to kind of interpret your own music, even on the day that it comes out. It's fine. And then put the instrument in its best showcase. You want to showcase the sound in the best way and showcase the song. And they kind of have to dance together a little bit. So I'm going to change the music to make it work for the keyboard, but the keyboard needs to kind of work inside of what ultimately how I want the music to come out.
Do you have a band playing with you, or is it solo?
It's solo, and I'm doing the whole thing. I took the Logic sessions, stripped them back. It's sort of like Tangerine Dream, the way they used to like play the tape. So I don't have tape. I got a laptop.
I just had one other question about Across the World to Be With You. There was a gorgeous analog lead sound. What is that?
It's a mini Moke.
Ah, okay.
It's this mini Moog that you can't see.
Oh.
I spent an enormous amount of time getting this sound. And as you know, you can't program things on a mini Moog. And so that sound sat on the keyboard for months. Like, people come in, but ultimately what happened, and if you listen to it, that sound shows up on every song on the album. And, there's people like Pat Metheny, he used that incredible Roland GR300, trumpet sound, that guitar synth sound. And he's used it so many times and it becomes kind of his voice in a way. And so I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have some sonic continuity between songs and to do something where the melodic, or at least in some cases, the partial melodic line was done by the same instrument across 10 or 11 songs. Okay. And so it was an interesting musical problem because not all of the melodies kind of like laid out in that sort of arcing way, across the world to be with you, which was actually one of the first songs I wrote for the album. And so all of a sudden it became a little bit of a struggle to make it work. And eventually I did. But thank you. It's a lovely sound. I worked very hard on it. That is definitely a sound that was helped greatly by processing.